Hi folks, Seth here. Thanks for watching my monologue. In these uncertain times, you may be thinking about personal protection. If you are, I urge you to visit my friends at Guns Etc. They'll help you find the perfect protection for yourself and your family, and they can even teach you how to use it. They've been protecting Arizonans for over 33 years, and they stand for the great principles this country was founded upon. Or you can just click on gunsetc.com. And if you like my monologues, please subscribe to 960 The Patriots YouTube channel. Welcome back and happy November 20th, 2020. Yesterday we celebrated the Gettysburg Address, a uniquely American piece of political philosophy that we gifted to the world. And then we lamented that while so many around the world still celebrate it, as it should be, by redounding to it when necessary, we here have buried it, either forgetting it or dismissing it. What we need here, it seems to me, is a great relearning. I take that phrase from the novelist Tom Wolfe. Writing in 1987, as usual, Wolfe was prophetic and ahead of his time when he was writing then about the 21st century. He wrote, "The Great Relearning, if anything so prosaic as remedial education can be called great, should be thought of not as the end of the 20th century, but the prelude to the 21st. There is no law of history that says a new century must start 10 or 20 years beforehand, but 2 times in a row it has worked out that way. The 19th century began with the American and French revolutions of the late 18th. The 20th century began with the formulation of Marxism, Freudianism, and modernism in the late 19th. And now the 21st begins with the Great Relearning. The 21st century, I predict, will confound the 20th century notion of the future as something exciting, novel, unexpected, or radiant, as progress, to use an old word. It is already clear that the large cities, thanks to the relearning, will not even look new. Quite the opposite. The cities of 2007 will look more like the cities of 1927 than the cities of 1987. How do you like that? Wolfe was off by just a bit, but the cities this year did look like the riotous and calamitous cities of the 1920s. He would continue on, quote, "The 21st century will have a retrograde look and a retrograde mental atmosphere. People in the 21st century, snug in their Neo-Georgian apartment complexes, will gaze back with a ghastly awe upon our time in the 1980s. They will regard the 20th century as the century in which wars became so enormous they were known as world wars, the century in which technology leapt forward so rapidly man developed the capacity to destroy the planet itself, but also the capacity to escape to the stars on spaceships if it blew. But above all, they will look upon the 20th century as the century in which their forebears had the amazing confidence, the Promethean hubris, to defy the gods and try to push man's power and freedom to limitless, godlike extremes," close quote. Limitless, godlike extremes. I want us to think about now how retrograde philosophies are making a comeback, as if new, as if untried, as if full of potential for greatness. Take Marxism or socialism. It has been spoken of more in the past 2 years, and positively, I might add, than it has in any 10-year period prior in America. Be warned about that. Irving Kristol wrote this a few years back, also prescient, quote, "Today we live in a world with an ever-increasing number of people who call themselves socialists, an ever-increasing number of political fideists who keep insisting that we must not judge socialism by any of its works, for it has never truly been tried. This is all quite ridiculous, of course. Socialism is what socialism does. The plaintive lament of the purist that socialism, or for that matter capitalism or Christianity, has never really been tried is simply the expression of petulance and obstinacy on the part of ideologues who, convinced that they have a more profound understanding than anyone else of the world and its history, now find that they have been living a huge self-deception. People who persist in calling themselves socialists while decrying the 3/4 of the world that has proclaimed itself socialist, who can find a socialist country nowhere but their imaginings, those people are anachronisms. as such, they do serve a purpose. They help the historian and scholar understand what socialists used to think socialism was all about. One could discover that from reading books, of course, but it is sometimes enlightening to interview an actual survivor. Perhaps the most extraordinary fact of our intellectual history is that all thinking about socialism takes place in non-socialist countries, close quote. Think about that for a moment. Where there is thinking and second-guessing is never in a country governed by versions of Marxist thinking or socialist government, only in free countries. And the actual survivors of regimes governed by versions of Marxist thinking, who were fortunate enough to come here, they warned us. The proponents of it, they never lived it. And yet here we are. Consider. The most famous movement of this past year, BLM, was founded by two people who proudly call themselves Marxist. It received hardly a blink, but instead a deference and embrace by elected officials almost everywhere. And to point this out or criticize it garnered and earned censorship. So we face something perhaps uncomfortable to talk about. It may have won a massive election. Whatever your regnant thoughts about recounts and election irregularities, it is clear that tens and tens and tens of millions of Americans voted to support a political party that did support and embrace all this, including censorship. Our warnings and survivors' warnings dissuaded little. So we can do one of two things: submit or push back. Of course, we will have the aiding and abetting of reality, actuality rather than theory and warning. A reimposition of critical race training will probably be the first thing. An attempt on our economy and greenery will be another. Look toward more benefits to non-citizens than efforts to socialize or redistribute income from roofers to AOC types to cover their college loan debt. We'll see efforts to re-engage rogue regimes because they share both socialist thinking and anti-Western philosophies. But you can't fight something with nothing. You can't put a genie back in a bottle that is broken. You can't fight nihilism, or for that matter, any other retrograde philosophy, with a nullity. And a nullity is what our education system has given us, backed by an entire culture that countenances it. For, as Crystal warned, the dead idea of socialism is now putrefying both in the world's mind and the world's body, where it used to exist. But it has to be fully removed and buried. And yet an erroneous idea can be expelled from the mind only by the active presence of another, better idea. This is why I spend so much time on things like the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln, the founding, and political philosophy generally. You may not, as I say, be interested in bad political philosophy, erroneous ideas, if you will, but they are interested in you. Thus the need for a great relearning. I think it's important for us to remember, because something is tried and didn't immediately succeed does not mean it should be dispensed with. Marxism doesn't think that way, clearly. Neither should we. So, okay, we lost the 1964 election and got the Great Society and then Nixon. Reagan lost the 1976 election and got us Jerry Ford and then Jimmy Carter. We ultimately got Reagan, but then gave up as if the fight was over, forgetting his most famous instruction, namely that because we had 8 years does not mean we had 80 years. Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same, or one day we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like to live in the United States where men were free. We all know the quote, do we live it? 8 years, say 1981 to 1989, is not 80 years. And the race towards socialism here has never been more aggressive. Not since 1989, or for that matter, since about 2 years ago. Consider that. Huge victories on our part. Say Reagan, say Trump. But only to yield to more aggressive and at the same time dressed up forms of socialism. Owning the White House, as it turns out, does not mean owning the schoolhouse. The schoolhouse ends up maybe being more important. Homeschool and charter parents, some understand this, but that still leaves something like 90% of our pupils in schools that, as the UFT just passed in its resolution, are embracing the BLM curricula. If you go to that organization's education website for the BLM curricula, you get right up front a quote from Assata Shakur, who is an escapee from our justice system for shooting a cop. She took up residence in and was given asylum by Cuba, still on the FBI's most wanted. Part of the curriculum, or I should say what the website calls it, demands. Part of the curriculum or their demands are to defund the police, which I presume means school resource officers. I guess when you quote people on the FBI's most wanted, that's what you would want to do. Get rid of the police. What amazes, and should amaze, is how far into the mainstream, or what used to be the mainstream, this stuff has run and flowed. Barack Obama's Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, was considered as moderate a Democrat as you can find, much closer then to a Joe Lieberman than to an Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And yet Arne Duncan tweeted just this month, quote, "We need to talk a lot less about red and blue and a lot more about whiteness," close quote. This from a white man who served a black president. I always worry about where the center of a party is and what is considered moderate. I don't think our movement has shifted its centers much from the ideals of the modern conservative movement circa roughly 1960 to 1989 and 2016 to now, but it's very clear the Democratic Party has moved their needle very far leftward on the groove that is the middle of their record. If you haven't tired of me quoting Harry Jaffa yet, I should close with this from him. The salvation of the West must come if it is to come from the United States. The salvation of the United States, if it is to come, must come from the Republican Party. And the salvation of the Republican Party, if it is to come, must come from the conservative movement within it. And the salvation of the conservative movement, if it is to come, must come from the renewal and reaffirmation of the principles of the American founding, embodied in the Declaration of Independence. Let's get to work. I'm Seth Leibson. We'll be right back.